A good Erev Shabbos. Will the world ever learn? It's a question that should haunt us all the time. We cannot get away from it at this awful and anxious moment in Jewish history, in Israeli history, when the death toll from the horrible pogrom 2 weeks ago continues to mount as more victims are found and buried. The trauma of this will not go away anytime soon. There is, of course, dancing in the streets and celebration among those whose greatest joy seems to come from our suffering. And as troubling and unsurprising as that is, the silence of the vast majority of the Western world, who cannot quite see their way to condemn what we've all seen, is even more troubling. Let's recall for ourselves a phrase we all know, but it's good from time to time to summon it up, to cite it, mention it, quote it, b'shem omro, in the name of the one who said it, which Pirkei Avos tells us brings redemption to the world, and let this idea be one of our guide stars in the days and months to come. Edmund Burke was an Irish statesman, economist, and philosopher in the late 1700s, and the maxim that is attributed to him is, quote, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. All the commentaries tell us that the Torah's statement about Noach, about Noah in our portion this week, it says, Ish tzadik haya bedorosav, a righteous person in his generation, meant to say that compared to everyone else, he was a good guy. But it's all relative. The contrast will be at the end of this week when we meet Avraham and into next week's portion, who is not content with just being a good guy. He wants to change the world for the good. And that, of course, becomes our goal too. But Noach is righteous in his generation, relative to his generation, meaning that he saw the corruption and immorality around him and could not change it. It's a point of debate whether he even tried. Nevertheless, he resisted allowing it to change him. He did little and was unable to prevent the triumph of evil, and at very least, based on this, God chose to let Noach and his family be rescued to start over again while the rest of humanity was wiped out. Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch comments, "The thought fills one with horror that as the product of thousands of years of the history of mankind, one single man and his family stand there alone. Shouldn't people have been getting smarter, more moral, more advanced? You would have hoped." We discussed last week in Shul about how the impulse to murder is ingrained in the human psyche. The thing for us to do is resist it. This week we read about corruption, crime, violence, oppression, cruelty, which the Torah gives a name to. It labels it Hamas. In the first Aliyah, we will read this Shabbat morning. I don't think that's what the founders of the terrorist organization had in mind when they organized themselves in 1988, but perhaps they knew better than they thought what they were really up to. The impulse, the tendency to let things slide into corruption and oppression and cruelty is also very much a human, naturally occurring tendency. Things that are important need tending and watching and maintenance. They cannot and will not run themselves without mindful guardianship and stewardship. Every generation, every person has to take up the responsibility to stand up for morality, fairness, and humanity all the time. There's a broken windows theory of decline. When a few small things start to slide, pretty soon bigger things start to slide, and it doesn't take long for indifference to give way to corruption and terror. Rav Hirsch further remarks that the other word for corruption in this verse, v'tishaches, from shachas, also has the meaning of a pit, like in Psalm 55. A pit is good for some things, like storage, but it can also get in the way and impede someone on their path and cause damage if a person falls in. Rav Hirsch says it means to be interrupted on the way to prosperity. Things could be better, but if we allow them to fall into disrepair, they will not fix or maintain themselves. For clarity's sake, certainly to get it straight in my own head, I want to read you excerpts from 2 documents so we are clear on where we stand, because it's a confusing world, even to many Jews, and we are urged to consider both sides, to examine our own faults before we call out others, etc., etc. I want to suggest to you that while it is a complicated world, it's not always so complicated. Some things are pretty clear. I recommend that you find these 2 documents online and share them with friends who have questions about the reciprocity, fairness, the quest for peace. Here are a few passages from the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel from May 1948. If you haven't read it in many years, it's definitely worth your while to have a look and remind yourself what underpinnings the state was founded upon. These may not be the most salient passages, but they might be the most timely for this week, for this moment. Listen to what they wrote, and remember, this is 3 years after the Shoah, with many Jews still in DP camps in Europe, and clearly unwelcome to return to their former homes, and with a British blockade of what we then called Palestine, because that was the official name of the British Mandatory Territory. The framers of Israel wrote these words: "The state of Israel will be open for Jewish immigration and for the ingathering of the exiles. It will foster the development of the country for the benefit of all its inhabitants. It will be based on freedom, justice, and peace, as envisaged by the prophets of Israel. It will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. It will guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture. It will safeguard the holy places of all religions, and it will be faithful to the principles of the Charter of the United Nations." The declaration continues, "We appeal, in the midst of the onslaught launched against us now for months, to the Arab inhabitants of the State of Israel to preserve peace and participate in the upbuilding of the state on the basis of full and equal citizenship and due representation in all its provisional and permanent institutions. We extend our hand to all the neighboring states and their peoples in an offer of peace and good neighborliness, and appeal to them to establish bonds of cooperation and mutual help with the sovereign Jewish people settled in its own land. The State of Israel is prepared to do its share in a common effort for the advancement of the entire Middle East." That's what they wrote 75 years ago. Now let's ask ourselves, has Israel lived up to every part of this declaration? Probably not 100% yet. Part of it is the neighbors, part of it its own issues, but is Israel trying? I believe so. Are these words still relevant? I believe so. Do they continue to guide Israeli society, and on good days, those entrusted to govern it? I hope so, and I think so. Now, this is not pleasant to do just before Shabbos, but for educational purposes, please forgive me for spoiling part of your Shabbat by even having to think about these things. Take a look, if you're so inclined and able to stomach it, what principles Hamas is founded upon, and who we're being called upon to treat with fairness and proportionality, whatever that might mean in these days. Hamas is an acronym for the Islamic Resistance Movement, and you'll see from their words that they are not shy to say what it is they're resisting. These words from its charter in 1988. Quote, "Our struggle against the Jews is very great and very serious." Quote, "Israel will exist and continue to exist until Islam will obliterate it, just as it obliterated others before it." Quote, "Initiatives and so-called peaceful solutions and international conferences are in contradiction to the principles of the Islamic resistance movement." Quote, "There is no solution for the Palestinian question except through jihad. Initiatives, proposals, and international conferences are all a waste of time and vain endeavors. They write more, if you can stomach it. Could there be a more stark difference? It's hard to imagine. Nevertheless, this is the adversary that the Jewish state, the Jewish people, are asked to deal with proportionality, with justice, according to the laws of civilization and fair play. We ask ourselves, how can there be a compromise with absolute evil? How can we play two-sidesism when one side is trying to make a better Middle East and a better world, and the other side is trying to murder the other side? It's a more absurd comparison than apples and oranges. At the end of our Parshas Noach, there's a rainbow. The Torah says, "Es kashti nosati ba'anan, v'haisa la'ois bris beini uvein ha'aretz." God says, "I have placed my rainbow in the clouds, and it shall be a sign of the pact between me and the earth." God promises never to destroy us again. God does not promise that God will hold us back from destroying each other. We have already arrogated to ourselves this power. Maybe some of you saw the movie Oppenheimer over the summer. Now we have to be that much more mindful and cautious and careful, now that we've claimed such power to destroy. We have to be careful to use our powers for good, for building, and for repairing. We persist, we continue to retain our humanity, our compassion, and our dignity in the face of a world that allows hate to poison its airwaves, its websites, its campuses, and its government officials who willfully refuse to see the stark reality. We ask again, will the world ever learn? Will it continue to allow itself to be drawn into the downward spiral of hate? Perhaps there is hope in small places. Last Friday, people, even in Toronto, were very nervous as there had been a call for violence worldwide against Jews everywhere. I think that, thankfully, not much happened. There was the burning of an abandoned historical shul in Tunisia and a few other acts of vandalism in South Africa. But in Germany, in Berlin of all places, some 350 local citizens formed a protective ring around a local synagogue during services, holding up signs that read, "Jewish Lives Matter," and photos of Israelis who had been taken hostage. So yes, people can change. People have control and responsibility for what they do. History teaches us everything and dictates nothing to us. We're free to choose the good. In every generation they rise up to destroy us, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu saves us from their hand. May we soon see days of peace and security among all peoples in our land, around it, and throughout what we call, sometimes ironically, civilization. Good Shabbos.